here at St. John's. As you all know, today is the first day of Black History Month, so we thought it'd be a great idea to start it off with the Great Debate, kind of like the movie Great Debaters with Denzel Washington. Hope you guys have all had a chance to see that movie. So there's going to be a debate, obviously, and there will be two teams. There's going to be the governing team and the opposition. On the governing team, we have Tim, Shivika, and Josh. Oh, that's this way. And then on the opposite team, we have Nelson, Nipun, and Katarina. So just to clarify, they're going to take two sides. So sometimes it's not necessarily what they believe, but they're trying to make a point. So after, there's going to be a discussion. We don't want anyone pointing fingers saying, oh, this person said that, so, going off of that. But so I'm going to hand it over to someone else, the debate team, so that they can explain the format of debate so you guys aren't confused with what's going on.
Hey everyone, really glad you're here today. So basically the motion or the topic for tonight's discussion is going to be this House supports a Black cultural identity. And on this side we're going to have side proposition, and on this side we have opposition. So this side's going to be pro the motion and this side is against. The way that it works is every speaker, they alternate in 7-minute speeches, and the first minute of that speech and the last minute of that speech is known as protected time, where you can't be asked questions. But in the middle 5 minutes of that speech, you have the opportunity for the other side to stand up and offer questions, known as points of information, but just really questions. And it's the prerogative of the speaker, of the person who has control of the podium, to kind of sit them down if they want to, if they don't want to have that question asked, or to take them and to allow them to ask the question. And then the person answers the question and continues with their speech. So what you should be looking for on both sides are basically like well-developed thoughts or reasons as to why you should support or be against the motion. Like I said, 7-minute speeches, and the last speaker on both sides, so that would be Josh and Nipun, will have the job of kind of summarizing the debate for you. From their perspective, so from the proposition perspective or the opposition perspective. So in those speeches in particular, you should expect them to kind of weigh the different issues that are in the round and explain to you why their side wins the debate. So yeah, I'd definitely like to leap off of what she said earlier and saying that these are not personal views. I mean, we have African Americans sitting on both sides of the debate, and it's not something that should be pointed fingers at or anything, stuff like this. So we hope that we'll have a great discussion, and I'd like to invite the first speaker for proposition.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here on the first day of Black History Month. And I want to talk about what makes Black history something that's possible. Because Black experience couldn't be more diverse. When we think about Haiti, and when we think about Sudan, and when we think about African American experience, these are very diverse experiences. But what is an essential element that unites all of them is that Black people throughout world history have been oppressed because of their Blackness, and despite this, have triumphed over this adversity. And I think that that's what we want to talk to you about today, as what is the essentialization of the Black identity that we support strongly, is the reminder in a form of identity that shows that Black people have overcome or triumphed through or made cultural contributions despite this oppression. So what we want to say is that we believe that strong Black identity uplifts an individual who still lives in a society that's dominated not by other groups like white people or by Arab people. And we think that that's what a Black identity means. And it's strong when it resists assimilation into that dominant identity. That means a Black person does things, wears things, and expresses things in ways that are sometimes different than the ways that a dominant group might. Okay, so they're going to talk to you on their side. They're going to come up here and say, we don't want to essentialize Black people. Black people are very different, and I already talked to you about that. But when we essentialize something that helps people in a world in which experience is fragmented and difficult, and when you face oppression still in your daily life, uniting with other people in a certain kind of identity shows the world that you aren't just an individual, but that you are an individual who has a history that you have overcome collectively. And we think that's something that's important to express. And it's also something that makes communication possible. So I want to talk to you about Jay-Z. We have a bunch of white kids in the suburbs singing, son, do you know what I'm pulling you over for? Yeah, because I'm young and I'm Black and my hat's real low. That isn't a kind of experience that white 14-year-olds would understand otherwise if Jay-Z hadn't crafted a strong black identity to communicate that message. So we also believe that strong black identity has important political messages, not just for black people, but for other people, in order that they can respond in more honest, more genuine, less racist ways to black experience and black identity, and to black people. And I want to give you some examples of, we also don't believe that black identity need be monolithic. It doesn't need to be the same thing. It can change over time. I'll take a second, Nelson. It's something that develops over time and where it allows black people to make choices about how they want to express themselves that are different than dominant culture. But first, Nelson.
In Jay-Z's song 99 Problems, where he says, because I'm young and I'm black, my hat's real low, he was making a case against racial profiling. That's not a case for a stronger black identity.
Okay, thanks, Nelson. What Nelson doesn't understand is that what makes possible that is that Jay-Z has a black identity. First, when he speaks. When you listen to a Jay-Z album, you already know who Jay-Z is. You know that Jay-Z is a successful black rapper. And that it's not like I'm young and I'm black and my hat's real low, isn't I am Jay-Z and this problem just happened to me one time. It only makes sense with the power that it has because you understand that this is something that does happen and it happens frequently. And it's that oppression that happens frequently that is what we are centralizing into black identity. Okay. I'm going to give you some examples of what black identity, a strong black identity can look like and how it can change over time and why this is a good thing. So we saw in America the Afrocentrism movement in the 80s, when people looked at current and modern African cultures and also ancient African cultures and used the dress and garb and wanted to learn Swahili in school and had their children learn things like Yoruba theater. We think that that is one expression of strong black identity. But then we also saw in the 90s there was a hip-hop intellectual movement. And we think that these are different expressions of black identity, but they also aren't necessarily exclusive. We also saw things like the Native Tongue Collective in hip-hop. And we have a Tribe Called Quest from our own Jamaica Queens right here, who mixed those two identities together, who used Afrocentrism and a hip-hop identity and showed that African oppression and oppression in a place like Jamaica Queens against black people has a similar connection. And that the ability to talk about those two types of separate historical events only exists because there's a strong black identity, the idea of blackness being what unites those two things. Katarina.
Tim, do I get to fit into the black identity?
Yeah, Katarina, you can be black. Yeah, that's cool. I think that what we can see is that. Let me use another example. So, thank you for segueing. In Mongolia, there are no black. What there is, though, this doesn't even work. There are a lot of people that, when they saw gangster rap, they make music videos where they're talking about, they use their own epic poetry, but they're like, in Mongolian, talking about how red the roses are, but they're using like gangster rap postures. And it allows those people to identify with a certain type of black identity to overcome their own oppression as Mongolians who are poor on the Asian steppe. And we think that people can opt into black identities if they choose to be, which is different from how it used to be when identity is something that someone else makes for you and says, oh, you're black if you have this. If your grandmother was black, and that makes you black. We think that now, because there's a black identity that black people have created for themselves, people can say, yeah, I identify with this, or identify with that. If you are wearing baby fat, right, then you're identifying with an aspect of black culture that or FUBU that white people aren't allowed to identify with. And you can do that regardless of how dark your complexion is. Okay. We also, what's really important, what I want to talk about is this erasure that happens when cultures are dominated. And what we see after the Holocaust, people wanted to deny the Holocaust because there is still prevailing anti-Semitism, which is why European nations preserved sites like Auschwitz, preserved sites where the horrible oppression and murder of Jewish people occurred. But black oppression, for example, in the United States, that oppression could not be preserved. You cannot preserve the site of the lynching. You cannot preserve the site of a place where someone is called the N-word. What can happen is that because racism occurs on the body and against the bodies of black people can remind everyone about that oppression with their own gestures, their clothing, and their language, reminding you, I got here. I got to college. I am a successful business person, and I still am different from you because I overcame more than you did, overcame more than I did to be where I am. And that is why we should support a strong black identity. Thank you.
I asked him a really important question. And you know, I'm not really satisfied with his answer. Because I don't really buy that I get to buy into the black identity. Do you want to know why? Because I have been mistaken for almost every race in the book that I am not. Because for a matter of fact, I am half black, and I shouldn't have to tell every single one of my friends that for them to know. So he wants you to believe that putting on a shirt from a certain designer means that you're black, or that you get to identify with black people, and that you know and respect the struggles of black people. And we think this is a really serious oversimplification of what it actually is. Because if I was over here, and I was saying, I sympathize with the struggles of black people, and you assumed that I was white, or you assumed that I was Latina, would you really respect that as much? We don't really think so. We think that he wants to tell you that you can opt in to being black, and you can't. Because as much as you can identify it for yourself, we have to face the reality that it's something that people identify for you. And for some people, it's very visible, but for others, it's not. So it's not really as clear as he wants to make it. It's not really as fun as it actually is, right? I'm going to talk to you about three things. I'm going to talk to you about race as an identity that is thrust on you. I'm going to talk to you about what happens when you don't fit in. And I'm going to talk to you about the alternative that my entire side is going to discuss with you, right? I've been in a classroom before where we're reading a book by an African-American author, and the teacher turns to an African-American student and says, "Rachel, can you give us the black perspective on this book?" I wasn't asked that question. My friend Rachel was. What happens is actually a phenomenon called the native informant, when one person is asked to summarize the opinions and beliefs of all black people. You do not have the same opinions as I do. So if I was to do that, I would disservice your beliefs. No one has ever been asked, can you please summarize the white perspective? I would really love to see how long that class lasts. What actually is happening is a standard is thrust on you. Because I was raised in a household where my parents told me, "Katerina, you are a black girl. So everything that you do, you represent us as a family, but you represent our people." So you have to understand that when you do something, when you get in trouble, yeah, it's going to say something about our parenting, but it's also going to say something about the race that you are. I have never met a white person that has ever been told, when you get in trouble, it will reflect negatively on the white race, and people will never be able to respect the right ways in the same way. Because being white, you do not have to prove anything from the start, and being black, you do. And I'm going to tell you a story, actually. I have a family friend who, along with 3 of his friends, were murdered in his apartment. And the story that was reported in the news was that 4 gang members were gunned down by the opposing side. He's never been a part of a gang. A summer camp volunteer. And that's the story that the news reported. Because that was okay, because he was black. And because that perspective reflected negatively on the entire neighborhood, on his entire group of friends. And that, while that is a tragedy, it's not completely abnormal. Because if Tim were to get arrested, a young male has been arrested. But when a group of black males are arrested, a group of black males are arrested. And that is what makes it into print. That's what goes on the news. That's what the TV reporter says, right? So it's not just that you're asked, it's bad enough that you're asked to summarize the opinions of all black people, but you're also asked to represent them, and that when you do wrong, you're held to a different standard. But you disagree.
The identity you're talking about that's being forced on black people is a racist identity. Well, we're not supporting that. We're supporting an identity that black people accept for themselves to protest that other identity that's forced upon them.
Okay, so actually this is a perfect segue. What happens when you don't fit in, right? Because he talked about in the 90s, the intellectual hip-hop movement. Well, let me tell you one group that the intellectual hip-hop movement did not serve. Homosexual people. So if you're a black man and you're gay, how do you have that conflicting experience? How do you like rap music that talks negatively about something that you are essentially, and then also be a black gay male. How do you do that? Because the black identity isn't associated with being homosexual. It's associated with being straight. And if you're not accessing part of the black identity. You don't fully get to be it. So growing up, when people said, "You talk white," I was instantly not participating in what they thought something that the black identity was. And I was missing out on that. So I'm sure that there are people who didn't respect me as much, didn't feel that they could confide in me as much because they couldn't relate to me as much because of what I look like or because of what I sound like. And we think that that is ridiculous, right? We think that interracial relationships are another example, right? It's this ridiculous standard. You should be falling in love with your own kind. You should be in relationships with people that understand the struggles that you go through. And if you don't, you're on the outside of it, right? We actually think that there's an alternative. We think that there's an alternative where you get to choose the person that you are, where you get to be your own identity, where when you get in trouble, it's your own fault. And yeah, maybe it's your parents' parenting, but it's not because you're black. And it's not because you are a gang member that happens to be black. It's because of you. We think that in the situation that we have now, in society today, it would be naive to say that race doesn't define you. We say that what they're telling us, right, is that race becomes your only identifier. It becomes your only qualifier. It becomes the single most important thing about you. And what we say is that race is important. It's an important thing about you. Black history is an extremely important and essential thing. But we don't think that that outweighs your personal identity. We think that there's a bigger thing to be said when the person that you are is valued more than the people that you're a part of. And we think that it's a shame that they actually would have us confuse those. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we just heard from Katerina right now is that we live in a world where racism is stark, racism is growing, and racism is everywhere. We see these kinds of discrimination in her own examples, in the stories that she spoke about. So in a situation where you're already conceding that the world that we currently live in is racist, where there is discrimination, we think that it's absolutely impractical and impossible to ignore the fact that you can pretend like people don't have differences in identity and just pretend and hope that all people will sort of give up their claim to their own identity and their own culture and just come together. We think that in this situation, what we're proposing to you, what we're trying to tell you is that it's essential to hang on to that sense of identity, to use that identity as a tool and turn it around as a source of positivity that you and the members of your community can use to remind yourself of your history, to remind yourself of the past, right? So what I'm going to tell you is about I'm going to talk to you about two things. I'm going to talk to you about how identity is formed and the experience of forming this identity. Tim talked about this earlier when he introduced the whole concept of the oppression and how people of this certain community have been through years and years of oppression in many different parts of the world. And then I'm going to talk to you about why it's important that people should hold on to that strong sense of identity today, especially because that's the kind of identity that can uplift them. That's the kind of thing that they can turn to when they do face situations of discrimination that they're going to talk about, right? So the first thing about understanding how identity is formed, right? So identity is not just something what we heard from them so far is this sense of confusing the difference between an individual's identity and an individual's choices and preferences and the identity of a community or a race as a whole. What we're going to tell you is that there's no such thing as a neutral identity. Everybody has an identity. Everybody comes from a past. Everybody has a certain sense of culture and sense of things that happen in their past that they can relate to. And that's the kind of thing that's their heritage. That's the kind of thing that binds people together and brings them together. So in a situation where we've already accepted that the reality of the society is that there is racism, how can we use this identity, this difference in identity that people have in a positive way, right? We can't ignore it. We can't just say that people shouldn't support a strong identity because that just leads to more reinforcement of wrong identities. I think what they've confused here, ladies and gentlemen, and this is an important distinction that we all must understand, is the difference between a racial discrimination and having an identity which is reinforced in a positive way. I'll take you in a second. So what we on our side are trying to tell you is that we can use identity as a really source of positivity by turning it around and using it as a source of inspiration. So when people face oppression, when people face discrimination in their daily lives, in their workplace, in their houses, in the school, they're able to look back at this identity and see what their people have come through over the struggles that the people have had over so many years, and use that as a source of inspiration, as opposed to just sticking and just having a negative connotation of that racism, which is what they've told you about. So they've only told you about one side of the picture, where the person is not really using that identity and taking it one step forward. What we're telling you is that people can use this difference and this discrimination in a positive way to overcome the struggles that they face in their life. But you would disagree.
You don't fight racism and discrimination by making racial identities stronger. That only makes the lines that create racial strife
Thank you so much for bringing up that question. That's perfect, because my next point starts with that very line. We're not in support of a strong racial identity. What we're in strong support of is a strong black identity. And that's a distinction that I think you people have completely missed on this side of the house, because I think what you're confusing is that any identity associated with a black person must be a racial identity. We strongly disagree. We think that black people have the right to choose identity, have the right of how they want to express themselves. Like Tim said, if black people want to express themselves by wearing certain clothes, by listening to certain music, by doing certain things, we think that they should have the right to. And that is a kind of strong black identity that we stand in support of. So you saying that any kind of identity associated with black people must be racist is absolutely incorrect. Because when black people embrace their own identity, when black people are the one who look back at their own history and their own struggles and use that as a source of inspiration when they face this discrimination, that's when they overcome the racial discrimination that they face. That's when they've won, truly. So moving on to my second point about how identity actually uplifts the individual, right? So I talked to you about how identity is the experience which has made you what you are today. You have an individual identity and you have an identity as a part of a community. But in the situation where you ignore that identity of a community, where you say that we're willing to overlook the struggles and the past history of our community, just because we think that it alienates people, we would disagree strongly with that, right? We say that as an individual, living without a strong sense of identity is exactly like living without a past, or living without any sense of culture, or what your ancestors have been through to get to that point, what has really made you. So we think that in that sense, that identity is really important for an individual to not lose sense of themselves. But also, I would say that identity is very important, because not only does it uplift the individual when they are faced with a situation of discrimination, but it also fosters a sense of community, a stronger sense of community. So when you're able to look at your identity with the reference to your past and your history, it brings you closer together with other people who have faced a similar discrimination, with other people who've had similar pasts of oppression, and relate to these people, and it brings you together in a way of fighting this oppression. So what we're trying to tell you is that don't look at identity just as a mere tool of enforcing racial discrimination. Look at identity as a source of positivity that you can use to overcome oppression, that you can use to unite people, that you can use to unite the community together in a way that ignoring it could never do. So basically, what we're trying to tell you is that in the situation that identity it includes so much more than just the racial discrimination that they've told you about. It includes your family history, it includes your past, it includes your culture. All of those aspects put together has made you what you are today. And when you're able to proudly identify yourself with that, we think that's a huge power that the individual should have. We think that that's a kind of strong identity that people need to have in this time and age in order to combat the kind of discrimination that they face in the outside world. And based on those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
When Tim started talking to you about the rappers in Mongolia who rap about roses but do this in very gangster rap ways, he said this is forming some type of black identity in Mongolia. What he failed to understand is that there's a difference between acting black and actually being black, right? So there's a difference if Tim comes up to you and says, yo, what's up, dog, versus if I do it, right? Because when Tim does it, you look at him like he's crazy because he's not actually black. Whereas if I do it, you might look at me like I'm crazy, but there's a higher chance that I get accepted into this identity because I'm black, and there's a higher chance that you accept me for this because I'm black, right? So what he failed to understand is you don't simply get to choose the type of identity you want to join into. This identity is thrust upon you because you were born a certain color. There is no choice based off of what they speak about. What I want to talk to you about more today is how black identity, like having this strong sense of black identity, actually masks certain issues or acts as a scapegoat in certain times, and why we think that is particularly harmful. But first, I need to address a lot of what they said on their side. He said that, like, oh, they need to collectivize because a lot of them have been oppressed because of their blackness, right? We say that you don't necessarily have to collectivize based off of the lines that they drew you. He said that they were oppressed because they were black. So now your solution is collectivize because you are black, right? We don't think that that's a logical solution, that just because you're black, you must now do everything together and the same lines that the oppressors drew for you. We don't think that that's where the most power comes from. We think more power comes from when you say that I can rise over this because I am me. Not because of anything that I was born into, but because that I am the person that I create for myself. We think that that's a much stronger message. But then we heard, like when he tries to define black identity, we think that he harms himself here, right? Because he says it's something that uplifts the individual that is subjugated, that is subjugated by dominant culture, right? But the same culture that he wants you to participate in, the same culture that he wants to strengthen, is the same culture that alienates and subjugates homosexual males. The same rap culture that he was talking about when he spoke of Jay-Z that subjugates women in almost every one of his rap songs, right? These are the cultures that he wants to make stronger. We disagree with that on principle. But then he says, like, when I asked him the POI, and this is really telling, he says, well, Jay-Z oftentimes creates this black identity, right? And it's one that can be very uplifting and very individual at the same time. If Jay-Z's creating the black identity, I don't see how it's individual for me, right? And I also, secondly, I wouldn't want Jay-Z creating the black identity for myself. I would want to create this identity that I want to join into. He can't have it both ways. He can't say that, oh, look at Jay-Z, he crafts the black identity, but at the same time, it's completely personal, though his albums are selling to millions and millions of people. You're not one of the people he's thinking about when he makes his rhymes, and it would be foolish for Tim to mislead you on that, right? But then he says that, like, well, you want to have this identity, like you want to have something that you can simply opt into. Right? When he says it's something you can opt into, this is where he say he's wrong. But Katerina gave you many examples of this, where she sits in a classroom and she's automatically, or somebody else is assuming to call on to give the black perspective. That's not something you opt into. That's something that society ascribes to you because you have a certain skin color. Then Shivika wanted to tell us about how identity is formed, right? Because, like, she told us black identity is formed based off of how you choose it to be formed for you. We think that this is just simply not living in real life. Because I don't get to choose, like, people tell me all the time that, oh, you talk white, right? Because I'm not supposed to talk a certain way if I'm black. You're not supposed to do certain things if you're black. That's not something that you choose for yourself. That's something that society has ascribed to you because they look at you and they say a skin color. And they say that if you want to be if you want to partake in this strong black identity, you must act as the rest of us act. We think that's harmful for anybody who wants to be different in this. For anybody who wants to be different. But then she tells us why you should hold on to it, right? So she said, so you don't lose a sense of yourself. We think that there's something better here, right? We think that, like, the history, black history, and so forth, doesn't necessarily have to come through an understanding of a very strong black identity. What we think is, what's most important is how you yourself relate to that history and how you view yourself in relation to that knowledge. We don't think it's something that necessarily needs a very strong black identity in order to thrive. So what do we want to talk to you about? We're going to tell you about how black identity makes mass issues or acts as a scapegoat. Go ahead, Tim.
What unites the black identity is that people look at you and they see that you're oppressed. If you are a passing person, if you are like, I'm half black, but you look white, the reason that you can't opt into black identity is because you don't face the oppression that black people face in the same way. Which is why I can't be like, what's up, dog? Because I am white. But the thing is, there can be, under that signifier of oppression, there can be multiple black identities that are about different things, about homosexual black experience.
Okay. So he says that, not everybody can opt into it because not everybody faces the same oppression, right? But then we say that it's really hard for me to tell what oppression Katarina has faced in her life by simply looking at her, right? So when he makes the assumption that, like, I can tell your oppression, I can tell your history just because I looked at you and I saw a skin color, so I can make these assumptions about who you are, we think that that's harmful because that individual identity is then lost and you become your skin color. Your race is your primary identity and that's how everybody else will look at you. We think that that's most harmful. But we tell you that black identity masks issues or acts as a very harmful scapegoat. We point you to the Allen Iverson case back in 1994, where he was accused of battery, right? And the majority consensus within the community of Virginia was saying that he's being accused simply because he is black, right? When you make these types of assumptions with a strong black identity, it becomes particularly hard to engage with these types of ideas because you're making assumptions based off of race. You're saying that, like, these things are happening to me because I'm black. Why do we think this is harmful? And why do we think it's harmful when you try to collectivize to solve these issues around racial lines? Because then race becomes the primary issue you're trying to solve. So when you try to solve these issues along racial lines, it becomes increasingly difficult to actually reach any form of compromise on these issues. Because people divert back into extreme ideological camps of race. And you don't want to be the person who crosses the line and betrays the rest of your race that's siding with Allen Iverson or siding with somebody else on any particular race issue. Just look at the 2008 election when Barack Obama was elected, right? You had people who said, like, if you voted for Obama, you're voting for him because he's black. If you voted against Barack Obama, well, why aren't you doing the thing that everybody else in your community is doing? Why aren't you voting for Obama? There becomes a group thing in this attitude. We think that's harmful because then you do not have a voice of your own. You must always voice the opinion of what the community wants you to think. At the end of today's debate, we want you to say that you can form your own identity and you can overcome your own personal structures. You can overcome oppression. It doesn't have to come at the hands of a black identity. It comes at the hands of your own identity, one you personally create. We're proud to oppose.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, what we've heard today throughout this debate so far, just to clarify everything that's happened and to make a conclusion so we can all understand what's really been talked about. It's really been about three things. What is the black identity? Two being, what is not fitting in? What does that mean? And then the impact of the black identity that we choose to bring you to here today. So first of all, what is black identity? On our side, on the side government, what Tim and Shivika talked about, we talked about a black identity that is based upon looking at the past and looking at the struggles and our ability to overcome what had happened. And our ability to create identity based around that so that we could go forward and accomplish more. Whereas on side opposition, they say black identity is they say black identity is scapegoating and is group thinking and everyone like being one of the herd. And they say that they apparently think that black identity is listening to rap music and so on. But that's not the case. Black identity on our side is this idea of history and what we've seen, the Afrocentrism and the intellectual rap and so on. But now the idea of not fitting in, because on our side, on the side government, when we don't fit in, when a group doesn't fit in, we believe that strong black identity will allow us to create our own identity. Will allow us to change our identity and make it more positive because we don't fit in, because we see that there's still discrimination and there's still oppression and so on, and that we need this to move forward. And then we also know that there is no neutral identity. Even the side opposition, they brought up that in the news that the black young men in the basement were gang members when they weren't. So we already know that there is not necessarily this neutral identity. And because there's no neutral identity, we need this strong black identity to bind us together because we can't ignore the fact that in the status quo right now, that the news and the popular media are painting a certain picture of black culture and black identity, and allowing and creating this strong identity allows us to create a beautiful culture, like we saw in the 1980s, with where we had a return to roots of African dress, and we had a Tribe Called Quest, and we had Jay-Z going in there and talking about something that happened, where you get pulled over for driving while black.
Josh?
Yes, go.
If black identity is currently so fluid, why have Nelson and I both been accused of talking white? Why now do we not say, you two talk black?
All right, thank you. So we right now, we're saying, like I just said, there is no neutral identity in the status quo. And as we see that if we don't create our own strong black identity, we don't do that, this will allow to fester and to happen where African Americans and minorities are identified and are categorized by the majority, by white. So we need that strong identity so we can say, no, black identity is speaking properly, is overcoming troubles, and being great businessmen and businesswomen, and being successful in your fields. And then we have the most important part here today, was the impact of black identity. On the side opposition, they bring up things like the news, where you have negative stereotypes. And they say that race is merely thrust on you with this black identity. And then Katarina came up and said that her parents told her to be better because she was black. Well, we think like you telling your kids to be better because they're black. We think that's good, first of all, because we want our children to be better, and we want for racial identity and for groups to use that to uplift themselves. And that's why we look at the past and we see that where we came from wasn't like we came from trouble, we came from oppression, and so we want to uplift and to look at history, a reminder of the triumphs that we have done and where we can go forward into the future. And they tell you that black identity is merely an oversimplification. But we're telling you, well, if we're merely focusing on overcoming our struggles and positive inspiration, as the first two speakers talked about, well, we think that's a good thing. We think that black identity should be telling you that you can achieve and that you can do better. The side opposition tells you that black identity merely subjugates women and gay males. But like, if you look at what we brought you today, we brought you Afrocentrism. We brought you a Tribe Called Quest. These groups and these movements didn't necessarily subjugate women and gay males. And when we talk about creating our own positive, our strong identity, that's not, since we're creating it, since we're not merely doing what society already says or what says is happening, we have that opportunity not to subjugate women and gay males. Then the side opposition tells you about they're forcing everyone to be the same and to act in the same way. But on side government, we're saying, well, if the same thing that we're talking about is overcoming oppression and becoming more and going to college and graduating, we think that's a good thing. But largely, the impact of black identity, it really comes down to uplifting the individual and having this helpful essentialism of what it means to be black and what it means to be African or to be black. Like when you see, even in places like Africa or the U.S., where Africans are oppressed by Arabs, or where we have a history of oppression by the majority groups here in the U.S., where we want that resistance to, where we want to have that identity, so that we don't necessarily need to resist to, where we don't necessarily need to assimilate to the majority groups, where instead African Americans and blacks all over can create their own identity and are not merely categorized by what the majority says they are. We're like talking white and so on. And we want to use this to inspire, because as individuals, as minority individuals, many of us face discrimination. And strong black identity allows you to look in the past, and when you're in a situation where you're being discriminated against, a strong black identity allows you to say, hey, those who came before me overcame that oppression, and I can do the same thing. And when you don't have that strong black identity, you don't have that background to look and think that you can do it, because you don't have anywhere to look. It gives you something. It gives you the foundation to stand upon and to say, I can because they did before me. And Shivika talked about how it brings people closer to the present, and it brings all of us closer to the present when we have this this foundation, not this foundation, but yeah, this communal foundation that we can all look to and say that, hey, we have this strong black identity, and it allows for greater uniting amongst people and communities to form. And for these reasons more, ladies and gentlemen, we proudly propose the motion. Thank you.
In a society where racism and discrimination still exists, when a black man walks into a room, the first thing people notice about him is his race. Side proposition wants to tell that black man, look, you should own that. You should own that identification that's thrust upon you by every single person in that room. But what we're saying is, maybe we'd have a better society if people didn't think of you as black the moment you walked into a room. Maybe they just thought of you as a guy, not a black guy. We think that's a better society to live under. Right? I'm going to answer 3 questions for you. I'm going to answer, what does a strong black identity look like? I'm going to answer, what does a strong black identity do for you? And finally, I'm going to answer the question of, what's the best society to live? But first, I want to deal with this, the conceptions that we're getting of like what a strong black identity looks like from proposition, because they're like tripping over themselves time and time again. They tell you that a strong black identity is one where you buy into history, buy into your cultural history, and you collectivize under communal oppression. Right? And they tell you things like, look, you can have your own individual identity under this strong black identity. You can have multiple black identities under this strong black identity. You can build your own identity under these strong black identities. That's not a strong black identity. That's an individualized identity that you create for yourself. That's not what strong black identities look like. You can't build a strong black identity, an identity that is based on a race, under simply just collectivizing under oppression and a mutual history. You need to buy into everything else that comes with that race, everything else that comes with that culture. A strong black identity does look like what Jay-Z talks to you about. It does look like what the Nation of Islam talks to you about. It does look like what in the 90s era hip-hop talked to you about. But they talk to you a lot more about than just, our history and our collectivizing under oppression. They talk to you a lot more about that. And we think that when you buy into that strong culture of black identity that they're talking about, that Tim talked about at the top of his speech, and that they've tried to shy away from throughout the rest of their speeches, we think a couple of really interesting things happen. So what does a strong black identity do for you? They tell you that it allows you to unite under discrimination, and it allows you to craft a unified political message. Well, first of all, realize that this is a reaction to racism. You're developing a strong racial identity as a reaction to a racism that exists. And in doing so, you're hoping to overcome racism. And we don't think that's how you're going to get that job done. Right? We think that when you develop strong racial identities, you only increase the lines that exist between different people. And that's why we don't think this is the way to overcome racism. Go ahead.
If James Baldwin was a gay man in Paris and wrote Giovanni's Room merely as a novel about a gay man in Paris, it wouldn't be the same novel as if it was about a black gay man in Paris. We think that there can be multiple black identities, but the uniqueness of them is that they're about a black experience.
Okay, let's go ask Jay-Z or any other leader of the black community who's crafting strong black identities today if they accept the fact that James Baldwin's novel was a novel about a black man or about a gay man, right? We think that ultimately what you do when you like say, look, you can have this little corner under a strong black identity, is that little corner is its own identity. We don't think that most people who buy into a strong black identity buy into that little corner of the strong black identity. It becomes its own identity unto itself. Right? And ultimately, that's what I want to talk to you about. Because what happens when you try and craft this little corner on your own? You get excluded if you don't fit into the overarching thing, right? So what does that mean? It means if you don't fit in, you're not part of the black identity. You don't get to do you don't get to do and say and experience the same things that that everyone else under the strong black identity does. So if you don't immediately look black and be identified as black, that means you don't get to be a part of this. If you don't fit into every single cultural baggage that comes with a strong black identity, like being gay, you don't get to fit in. And we think that's really bad. But we think that even if you do fit in, you're still not okay. Because all of a sudden, you're being forced to fit in. Because now when you walk into a room, it is the first thing people notice about you. And they attach that strong black identity onto you, whether you want it or not. The assumption under their side has always been that, look, every single black person experiences the same kind of oppression, and therefore they should collectivize under it. But that's not true. Every single person's experience is different, and every single person's experience stems from a different history, stems from a different life. And we don't think it's fair to thrust a strong black identity onto each and every single person, because you're assuming that maybe they got oppressed the same way and for the same reasons. We don't think black women get oppressed for the same reasons as black men. And we don't think every single woman or every single man gets oppressed for the same reason. But we still expect that the strong black identity is thrust upon you when we believe it exists, right? It becomes the first thing people see and the first thing people think about. And we don't think that's a good way to live our lives, right? Finally, we'd say society is worse under this idea, because then racial issues become racial even if they're not. Right? So under like Nelson's example of Allen Iverson, or when Kanye West tells you that George Bush doesn't care about black people and that's why he's not sending aid to Katrina, all of a sudden the issue becomes, is George Bush racist? And not, should we be sending aid to Katrina and what's going on with the floods there? We think it winds up masking certain issues. All along, towards the end of their case, they've tried to tell you that, look, you should be crafting your own individual identity. And we agree with that. We don't think you can do that when you have a strong black identity that exists. Because if you don't, because some people can't buy into it, and some people can't get out of it. And so there's no way to create an identity for yourself if a strong black identity already exists for you or against you. That's why we'd say that you should be crafting your own individual identity that's outside of your race, that ignores your race and is about you and what you've experienced and how you want to live your life. That's why we're here.
If you guys have any comments or questions or just any, general reaction to the debate, you guys can say it. Do you guys have anything? Any questions? Anyone?
I had a question for the young lady in the middle. Correct me if I misunderstood you, but you were placing an emphasis on distinguishing between black identity and saying that it was not the same as racial discrimination. If I'm not wrong, I think they were trying to emphasize on individuals forming their own identity, but by you saying black identity, are you not from the beginning placing an emphasis on race already?
So there's an emphasis on the race, but not on the racial discrimination.
Right.
The point that we were trying to clash on is that the example that they used about a person when they walk into a room, you can either say, oh, a guy walks into a room, or a black guy walks into a room. Well, when a black guy walks into a room, regardless of how he's dressed or how he's talked or how he speaks or what he does, that will be the way in which people will identify you. But in the situation in which people of the community, black people of the community, start to actively create their own identity and embrace it in a way where they're not saying that, well, we're going to forget or we're going to leave our identity that's forced upon us because we're discriminated based on it. But when you actually start crafting your own identity on your own terms and not falling prey to what the majority is telling you, that's when you're actually turning it around. So now it's not about racial discrimination, but you have a racial identity which you can embrace and which you can be proud of. So that was kind of the point that I was trying to get at.
Okay, so with your example of Jay-Z,
if somebody racially profiles you as soon as you come into a room, for example, I know that he said that he would not be the person to enable other people that he knew or quote unquote put them on to the art that he was doing in terms of the music. Why should one man carry his race on his shoulder and everyone else have to fall to that stereotype?
Well, okay. I don't think it's a question of like, I think the point that, the distinction that we on this side of the house were trying to make was that you can't choose whether you're black or not, right? So that's something, the racial part of it is not in your control. But what you can choose is how you represent yourself within that racial identity that you do have, that you have no control under. So as a person who is black, you can choose to opt out of identifying with what Jay-Z is saying, or with his music, or with the clothes, or with whatever aspects of culture that you're talking about. But what you can't opt out of is being black. So if that's already going to be forced upon you, that racial identification of like seeing you as a black person, pinpointedly, then in that situation it's important for you to actively change the identity and create your identity. So like when they say that it's important to have individual identity, like we agree with them on that, but we don't think that that necessarily gets in the way of having a strong communal identity. Like we don't think that those two things can exist together. We think that they can.
So what do you guys think? Do you think it should be community-based or should it be like individually-based?
Like the topic, this specific topic.
Oh, this house supports black identity. Strong identity, yeah.
Well, at that point, it would be like an individual basis because if you don't accept like who you are, either black, white, Latino, or anything like that, that's an individual kind of concept. If you're not willing to accept that, then you end up moving away from that. Thus you have